Welcome to the deep dive. We've got, well, quite a stack of sources today. They really paint a picture of modern corporate power in all its facets. Everything from AI disruption in Silicon Valley to the kind of deep, almost hidden workings of Wall Street. And then you have these larger-than-life figures, the titans running it all, sometimes chaotically.
Exactly.
So I think our mission today is really synthesis. We need to pull out the core mechanics. How are these massive economic empires actually built? How do they get challenged? And let's be honest, how are they often maintained through, incredible risk-taking, sometimes even outright manipulation?
Yeah, looking for those common threads, right?
Yeah.
Ambition, control.
And speed. Astonishing speed seems to run through all of this material.
And that speed factor is key, isn't it? We really want to give you, the listener, the kind of detailed understanding, the surprising facts behind the curtain that lets you see things clearly.
Because whether it's about shaving microseconds off a trade or being the first to apply a new AI technique, it feels like the battle often goes down to who moves fastest, who has the most data, and ultimately who can exert the most focused influence.
Okay, so let's dive right into that tech frontier, AI. What really jumps out from the sources is this shift. The buzz around deep learning isn't so much about fundamental discovery anymore.
It's about application, right?
Yeah.
Taking that core power of deep learning, pattern recognition, optimization, making decisions fast, and just applying it everywhere. Logistics, medicine, you name it.
Precisely. And realizing that is what kicked off this sort of intellectual arms race maybe a decade back. You see it really clearly in the early 2010s with the big U.S. tech players.
Like Google.
Yeah. Google saw the writing on the wall. They snapped up Geoffrey Hinton's deep learning startup back in 2013. And then, boom, 2014, they go after DeepMind in the UK.
AlphaGo people.
The very same. And they paid, what, over $500 million for it? These weren't just casual investments. It felt more like a scramble, a defensive move almost, to lock down the talent, the actual deep learning experts, because they were scarce.
And those moves, they signaled this really big conceptual pivot.
Yeah.
It changes how we should think about AI progress today, doesn't it? We kind of moved out of pure discovery.
Into what one source calls the age of implementation. That's a great term for it.
It is.
It's the basic breakthrough, the core of deep learning. It's happened. We're not really holding our breath for, some magical general AI to suddenly appear.
Right. The focus is deployment now.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Using that pattern recognition power for diagnosing diseases, managing huge supply chains, writing insurance policies, running autonomous cars. The real value, the currency in this age, is having the entrepreneurs and engineers who can take that breakthrough and actually roll it out commercially at scale.
Speaking of scale and commercial deployment, we absolutely have to look east. China. For years, the story in the West was, they just copy things.
The copycat label.
But the sources show something totally different. China's built this indigenous, really unique digital world that just works differently.
And it's partly because their market developed differently, the demographics, the infrastructure.
Yeah.
It allowed for things that maybe wouldn't have taken root the same way here. Like, comparing WeChat to Facebook doesn't quite work, does it?
Not really, because WeChat isn't just social media. It's, what did the source call it? A digital Swiss Army knife.
That's it. It pulls together all these functions we use dozens of different apps for in the West. You've got your messaging, sure, but right there in the same app, you're paying for groceries, ordering food delivery, booking a doctor's appointment, doing your banking.
It's credible integration.
And it stood on three main pillars, according to the sources. First, this huge population that skipped the PC age and went straight to mobile-first users.
Okay.
Second, WeChat itself acting as this dominant national super app platform. Everyone's on it.
Right.
And third, mobile payments just took off. Everyone's smartphone became their wallet. And that combination, mobile first, super app, mobile payments, it just fueled this explosion of what they call online to offline services. O2O.
And the real world changed fast because of it. I mean, the sources say Chinese cities basically became the first cashless societies since, the barter system?
Yeah.
That's kind of mind-blowing.
It really is a historical marker, and the impact on cities was huge. Think about transportation.
The bike sharing.
Exactly. Those intelligent bike-sharing systems, they completely changed how people moved around cities. And just by doing that, they created, at the time, the world's biggest Internet of Things network. Just millions of bikes with GPS, all talking back to a central system. The scale and speed of that rollout, it's hard to match.
So if we pull back and look at the global picture, where does the competition really stand now between, say, the U.S. and China in AI.
Well, the U.S. still seems to have a clear lead in what you'd call business AI software optimizing internal company processes. But China is incredibly strong in internet AI, the apps we all use, and perception AI, things like image recognition, facial recognition. And they're catching up really fast in autonomous AI, like self-driving tech.
And the main battleground seems to be the developing world.
That's where these AI services can potentially leapfrog older infrastructure. But there's a strategic difference emerging. U.S. companies like Uber or Amazon, they often try to go in and dominate a market with their own product, centrally controlled.
But Chinese tech giants are doing something different.
Often, yeah. Instead of trying to plant their own flag everywhere, big players like Alibaba or Didi, they're frequently investing heavily in local startups in those developing countries, giving capital to the scrappy players on the ground.
Interesting. So it's influence through partnership rather than direct conquest.
It seems like it. It leverages local know-how, maybe sidesteps some regulatory hurdles, and it could really reshape the global economy in the long run. Influence through investment, not just selling your own product everywhere.
But that strategy, that focus on speed and scale, it obviously carries huge risks. Which brings us to the spectacular flameouts. We have to talk about startups like Theranos and FTX.
Oh, absolutely. These are just brutal cautionary tales. What happens when the story, the ambition just completely detaches from the underlying reality, whether it's science or finance?
Theranos is almost the textbook case for narrative over science, isn't it? Holmes's whole pitch was miniaturization. Dozens of tests from one drop of blood via this special cartridge.
But the actual science was incredibly difficult. To get enough volume for their machines, they had to dilute those tiny blood samples heavily with saline.
And what did they do to the tests?
It basically wrecked the chemistry, made it incredibly hard, maybe impossible, to get reliable, reproducible results.
Right.
Which is, the entire point of diagnostic testing.
So when the science wasn't working?
The culture shifted. It went from trying to innovate to trying to hide the problems. Concealment.
And the cover-up involved, well, a pattern of behavior, evasion, delays.
Totally. They stonewalled regulators, journalists, wouldn't give straight answers about which tests were run on their own Edison machines versus standard off-the-shelf commercial analyzers. There were really alarming allegations, too, like about the faulty potassium tests.
What were those?
Potassium levels are critical. Errors can be life-threatening. One manager apparently alleged that the company lied, claiming problems were fixed and hadn't affected patients, when maybe they had. That's serious.
And when CMS, the regulators, showed up for a surprise inspection, their reactions spoke volumes.
Right. Instead of opening the doors, they stalled. The CMS inspectors were apparently made to sit through this long PowerPoint presentation. Balwani and the lawyers insisted on it. It just screamed desperation, trying to buy time, avoid scrutiny.
So that's scientific deception. FTX feels like, well, financial deception on an epic scale.
Yeah.
Built on misplaced trust and, again, incredible speed in an unregulated space.
Yeah, FTX was the public face, the exchange. But the real engine behind the scenes, according to the sources, was Alameda Research, Sam Bankman-Fried's trading firm. He owned, 90% of it? Right. And Alameda got huge, way bigger than FTX itself. It was acting like this giant, unregulated hedge fund, almost like a shadow bank. It pulled in billions, not just SBF's money, but borrowing heavily from other crypto lenders, places like Genesis and Celsius.
And they were paying crazy high interest rates for that capital, weren't they? 6% to 20%.
Yeah, rates like that just scream risk, high risk, desperate need for cash. But the really shocking part was the direct pipeline from FTX customer funds.
This is the fiat at account?
Exactly. The sources detail how something like $8.8 billion of FTX customer money ended up being deposited into this one specific account held by Alameda. And it was just labeled fiat at.
$8.8 billion in an account just called fiat at het, sitting inside the trading firm, not the exchange.
Right.
How did that not set off massive alarms?
Well, the arrangement apparently started way back in 2019, almost out of necessity. FTX was new. It couldn't get its own proper U.S. bank accounts to take dollar deposits.
So they used Alameda's account.
Yeah, Alameda already had some maybe disguised bank accounts, so customer dollars flowed through Alameda first. And this apparently went on until July 2021 when they finally got an account with Silvergate.
So for almost 2 critical years.
Customer money was being commingled with Alameda's operations from day one. The lines were blurred right from the start.
That kind of audacity with billions of dollars. It actually echoes some of the stuff we saw in earlier eras of high finance. Thinking about the 1980s leveraged buyout market, that RJR Nabisco battle was legendary. Talking about corporate warfare.
Oh, RJR Nabisco was epic. A proper corporate civil war. You had the CEO, Ross Johnson, making this bid to take the company private himself.
Management buyout.
Right. And then Henry Kravis from KKR jumps in, challenges him, and immediately sets this price floor, $90 a share minimum. It became intensely personal and very public.
And Johnson himself became a factor, didn't he? His reputation.
Hugely. He'd become this sort of national symbol of, well, corporate greed. His lifestyle, the corporate jets, the perceived self-dealing. The board technically just had to get the best price for shareholders. But our sources suggest they were kind of quietly relieved to have Kravis as an alternative.
They didn't want to hand it to Johnson.
There was definitely concern about the massive debt needed for any deal. But yeah, the idea of Johnson winning was uncomfortable for them. It played a subtle role in how things unfolded.
And that whole LBO craze paved the way for the rise of giant private equity firms like Blackstone. Once they started raising these enormous funds, billions and billions.
They needed scale, right. They couldn't just buy small companies anymore. They had to hunt bigger game. Massive targets were required.
And the debt markets basically handed them the ammunition.
Completely changed the game. The key was the boom in securitized debt, structured finance, basically bundling up big loans and selling slices of them off to investors.
Okay, so how did that change how the banks making the original loans behaved?
This is crucial. The banks stopped acting purely like long-term creditors holding the risk. Once they could securitize the debt, sell the risk on to pension funds, insurance companies, whoever, they weren't on the hook as much if the company defaulted down the line.
They just collected fees for arranging it all.
Exactly. They became incredibly profitable middlemen. And suddenly, there was much less incentive for them to be super cautious about the quality of the debt they were originating. Sound familiar?
Yeah, sounds a lot like the lead up to the 2008 housing crisis, just with companies instead of mortgages.
It's the same basic mechanism. Just like banks were throwing money at subprime mortgages, they started pumping vast amounts of high-risk debt towards the private equity firms for these buyouts. And all that cheap capital let the PE firms bid company prices way, way up.
And Blackstone had this particular insight, this buy, wholesale, sell, retail idea. You see it with their EOP deal, equity office property.
Yeah, that was a classic example. How does that work? Buy, wholesale, sell, retail in this context.
Well, they'd buy the entire public company, like EOP, often using a ton of that cheap debt, a godfatherly price, as one source put it. Then, almost immediately after the deal closed, they'd turn around and sell off big chunks of it, maybe a third or more of the best, most easily sellable assets, like prime real estate in EOP's case.
Okay.
The cash from those quick sales instantly paid down a huge portion of the debt they'd just taken on to buy the whole thing.
So they recover a big chunk of the purchase price right away.
Exactly. Which means the remaining assets, the bulk of the company they still hold, they now own for effectively a much lower cost. They got the rest for a song, as the saying goes. It was incredibly clever financial engineering.
Okay, moving from billions in debt to, well, fractions of a second. Let's talk about high-frequency trading, HFT. This is where the arms race gets physical, down to the length of cables. The key resource isn't money anymore, it's time. Nanoseconds, almost.
Right. When trading moved off the physical floors, off the NYSE floor with people shouting,
and into computers, into the black box matching engine that actually executes the trades. It created this bizarre race for physical proximity.
you'd think computerizing it would mean less physical space needed.
Ironically, the opposite happened. The old NYSE building may be 46,000 square feet. The new data center out in Mahwah, New Jersey, where the actual exchange computers live, it ballooned to 400,000 square feet.
Why so big?
Primarily to sell space. That extra square footage was prime real estate for HFT firms to place their servers as physically close as possible to the exchange's matching engine. It's called co-location.
And they pay millions for that closeness, just to be milliseconds faster.
Yep, because that gives them what's called latency arbitrage. They can see a price change happen on the exchange, process it, and send an order based on that new price, literally fractions of a second before slower traders even see the change.
Wow.
And it went beyond just co-location. They obsessed over the data routes too. HFT firms apparently paid telecom companies fortunes for secret maps of their fiber optic networks.
Maps.
To know the exact physical path a signal would travel, down to the inch. So they could find the absolute shortest, fastest fiber route between exchanges, shaving off even more microseconds. One source described these maps as fucking gold.
Okay, so this feels inherently unfair. The system is rigged for speed, which led to IEX, right? The exchange Brad Katsuyama started, featured in Flash Boys, they put in a speed bump.
Yeah, the famous 350 microsecond delay.
How does deliberately slowing things down actually help the average investor against these super fast predators? It sounds backwards.
It is counterintuitive, but clever.
Yeah.
First, IEX designed their network so orders they sent out to other exchanges would arrive everywhere at the exact same instant, no arbitrage there. Then they added the speed bump, a coil of fiber optic cable that deliberately delayed any order coming into IEX by just 350 microseconds.
Okay, 350 microseconds. What does that tiny delay achieve?
It's just long enough to kill the HFT's main advantage. If an HFT firm sees an order hit IEX and tries to race ahead of it, maybe sending a predatory order to IEX itself and another exchange simultaneously to exploit the price change, that 350 microsecond delay gives IEX just enough time to see what's happening in the wider market, update its own price if needed before the HFT's predatory order can actually execute.
It neutralizes their speed advantage for that specific predatory strategy.
Exactly. It eliminates that specific type of latency arbitrage on their exchange. It was a direct counterattack using physics.
But this constant drive for an edge, whether it's leverage or speed, it often tips over into outright manipulation. The LIBOR scandal was a huge example, traders rigging a fundamental global interest rate.
And the details that came out, like with Tom Hayes trying to manipulate the yen LIBOR rate, show it wasn't accidental. It was deliberate deceit. He used things called switch trades.
What are those?
Basically pointless offsetting trades designed purely to generate commission for the brokers who were helping him by submitting the false lower LIBOR numbers he wanted. It was like laundering the bribes through trading activity, outsourcing the fraud in a way.
And the transcripts, the chats, they showed these guys knew it was wrong, even if the rules hadn't explicitly forbidden that specific switch trade tactic yet.
Oh, absolutely. Hayes was caught whispering on a call, "Don't fucking put it on chat." That shows clear awareness you shouldn't be documenting this. He even said to someone else, "The point is, I'm not really supposed to do it, am I?" Another trader involved apparently made sure to vary the timing and size of these trades so auditors wouldn't spot a pattern they knew.
And the reaction from regulators was interesting too, especially comparing the UK and the US approach.
Yeah, the UK's Serious Fraud Office, the SFO, they moved really fast, filed criminal charges quickly, but maybe too quickly.
How so?
They seemed to operate on the assumption that Tom Hayes would just plead guilty and cooperate, testify against everyone else. Big assumption.
And he didn't.
No. And because the SFO was so focused on getting charges filed fast, maybe beating the Americans to it, they apparently didn't do the really deep dive investigation. They didn't interview all the lower level witnesses, didn't chase down every document trail. They even turned down offers of help, wanting to keep it internal.
So their rush potentially weakened their own case in the long run.
It seems that way. Compared to the Americans, who tend to build these massive, document-heavy cases, the SFO's approach, while fast, might have lacked that ultimate depth because they banked too heavily on that early guilty plea.
So we've looked at the systems, the tech world, the financial machinery, but these systems are always driven by people, often by really singular, intense personalities, which brings us to the founders themselves. The chaos, the drive, the sheer force of will.
Absolutely. When you look at figures like Elon Musk, Bill Gates, Steve Jobs, there's this shared intensity, often abrasive, often demanding, driven by some kind of internal mission that just overrides normal management rules.
Take Musk. His stated mission isn't just building cars or rockets. It's
making humanity a multiplanetary species. It's this huge, almost spiritual goal.
right. And how does that translate down to, like, managing Twitter or Tesla?
Into extreme demands and zero tolerance for delay, or what he sees as inefficiency, pushing engineers relentlessly on full self-driving, maybe faster than regulators were comfortable with, demanding radical staff cuts, get rid of everyone but the muscle, as he put it. 80% in some cases.
Wow.
And that famous example about moving servers, he dismisses the complexity, calculates it should only take 2 weeks, and says, you know, if you just got a goddamn U-Haul, you could probably do it by yourself. It's a mindset that prizes raw speed and force over careful process.
You see similar kind of maybe confrontational drive with young Bill Gates, right? Back in the Mitzi days.
Definitely. Everyone acknowledged his brilliance, but his style. Ed Roberts, the founder of Emits, called him a spoiled kid, said he was so difficult sometimes they just excluded him from meetings to get things done.
But that same intensity fueled Microsoft's early strategy.
Oh, yeah. He'd work all night, crash on the office floor, wake up with coffee and be ready to go. And when IBM announced TopView, their potential competitor to Windows,
He didn't flinch.
No, he went into overdrive, immediately started building alliances, got, 24 computer makers, big names like Compaq, HP, Zenith to commit to supporting Windows. It was a brilliant strategic counter move that basically checkmated IBM in that space early on.
And then there's Steve Jobs, probably the archetype of the unfiltered, demanding founder.
Yeah, the stories are legendary. John Scully, who Jobs hired and then famously clashed with, said he'd literally recoil at Jobs' rudeness. If Jobs didn't like code someone showed him, he might not even look closely, just toss it back and say, I know they can do better. No filter.
But Jobs was also the pragmatist, wasn't he? He's associated with that whole rebellious hacker thing, but he steered Apple in a very commercial, very closed direction.
That's the fascinating contradiction. Wozniak, his co-founder, was more the true hacker idealist, wanted to share the Apple I designs. Jobs was the one saying, no, we sell the boards. He pushed to make Apple a proper corporation, and the Macintosh itself,
Famously closed.
totally closed system, no expansion slots. You needed special tools just to open the case. It was the absolute opposite of the open architecture, tinker-friendly philosophy of the early computer hobbyists. He built his empire by ultimately rejecting the purity of those early ideals.
When you combine that kind of intense personality with immense wealth and the desire for absolute control, sometimes it just spirals into pure eccentricity. Howard Hughes is maybe the ultimate cautionary tale there.
Hughes is such a paradox. Brilliant engineer, daring entrepreneur early on, and then the last 15 years, this extreme isolation. Refusing to bathe, hair and nails growing incredibly long, living in squalor, urinating in jars.
It's almost impossible to fathom how someone could run a global business empire like that.
Well, that's the thing. He somehow still managed aspects of it, mostly his image. In 1972, he did that bizarre telephone press conference. There were rumors he was dead or completely incapacitated, sketches showing him looking like a hermit.
And he addressed it.
Yeah, he joked about it. When asked about the long fingernails in the sketches, he reportedly quipped something like, how could he possibly sign all the documents he'd been signing if he was tangled up in fingernails like that? He could still perform, still project control, even from deep seclusion.
Other titans show a different kind of chaos, the chaos of sheer scale. William Randolph Hearst.
Hearst's empire just got too big even for him to track. His record-keeping was a mess. There's a story from 1921 where he suddenly wants this painting of Napoleon he bought 20 years earlier in Paris. He's no idea where it is. Had to get teams of people digging through old records, contacting dealers, freight companies, just to find something he bought.
And he forgot buying other things entirely.
Apparently. Another time, he completely forgot he'd bought a couple of Egyptian bronzes just months before. When your empire gets that vast, your personal control inevitably breaks down. You become more like a curator who occasionally forgets what's in the collection.
And finally, J.P. Kennedy. His focus when leaving his company, FBO, after RCA bought it. It wasn't about the company's future, was it?
Not at all. When David Sarnoff from RCA asked him for advice about running FBO, Kennedy's response, according to the sources, was all about him. He reportedly said he'd be happy to advise Sarnoff on anything I think would be of any value whatsoever to you. The emphasis was entirely personal. His priority was securing his own fortune and his family's legacy, not the ongoing success of the business he was leaving.
It really underscores that for many of these titans, the company is just the vehicle.
The vehicle for their ambition, their control, their wealth creation. Which leads us nicely into the bigger picture, the long-term view of what happens to all this accumulated capital. Thomas Piketty's work is really key here.
Right. Piketty gives us this historical framework for understanding wealth across generations. What's the core idea about capital versus growth?
His central argument often boiled down to that inequality, or GRG, where the average rate of return on capital and G is the rate of economic growth, is that society is dominated by inherited wealth, where your place in the hierarchy is mostly set by what you inherit. Those societies tend to emerge and persist mainly when economic growth is low.
Okay. And he argued that the big decrease in inequality we saw in the 20th century wasn't necessarily permanent.
That's the critical point. That compression of wealth inequality wasn't really because labor got radically more equal. It was mostly driven by shocks to capital. 2 world wars destroying physical assets, high inflation eroding the value of existing fortunes, and crucially, the introduction of very high taxes on top incomes and inheritances.
So those things artificially push the return on capital down, often below the growth rate for a period.
Exactly. It temporarily broke that dynamic where wealth just accumulates and concentrates faster than the economy grows. It wasn't a fundamental shift in capitalism itself, but the result of specific historical events and policies.
So now that those factors, major wars, really high top tax rates have mostly faded, what does Piketty predict?
Well, the prediction is pretty clear. As we seem to be returning to a lower growth environment globally, which many developed economies are experiencing.
The old dynamic of re-GLI likely reasserts itself.
Precisely. We're likely to see a major comeback for the importance of inherited wealth. The kind of massive fortunes being built today by the figures we've discussed, the Musks, the private equity billionaires, maybe even the crypto fortunes if they persist. They set the stage for a new era where inherited capital, passed down through generations, becomes a dominant factor in economic and social structures. A return to a kind of 21st century gilded age. Hashtag tag outro.
Well, this has been quite the journey through the engines of modern power. We've seen the sheer speed of AI development, China's very different digital path.
And the spectacular ways things can go wrong, like Theranos and FTX, where the story completely overtook reality.
We dug into the mechanics of corporate warfare and finance, too. Blackstone's LBO strategies, the almost absurd race for microsecond advantages in HFT.
And the deliberate deception in the LIBOR scandal. And tying it all together, these intense, often chaotic personalities driving the empires: Musk, Jobs, Hughes.
Yeah. And pulling it all together, the consistent theme seems to be access, doesn't it? Access to data, access to speed, and maybe most importantly, access to huge amounts of capital. Success often seems tied to having those things, sometimes completely separate from traditional business ethics.
It creates these cycles: boom, manipulation, consolidation, collapse sometimes, constantly reshaping things.
So that leads to a final thought. If we take Piketty's analysis seriously, that we might be heading back towards a world dominated by inherited wealth because growth is slowing.
Then what? Given how mobile capital is, how easily it can flow around the world, often unregulated,
Yeah.
what kind of bold, maybe even radical structural changes would actually be needed? Think about something like a globally coordinated tax on capital, which Piketty himself proposes.
Which many see as totally unworkable or even dangerous.
Right. But the question is, what would work? What could preserve the openness we need for economic dynamism, but also effectively regulate this global system against the kind of manipulations and concentrations of power we've spent this whole time discussing? It really challenges the foundations of how these modern empires operate. Something to think about.